We have had a student request to look at this Part B question from Theme 4. I like the fact that a student has requested this because it shows that they are looking for gaps in the spec, because this is something that is untested. So I'm going to take you first of all to the specification. And theme 4B is the importance of the Eucharist in the life of contemporary Christian communities. So as a question, that would be, explain the importance of the Eucharist in the life of contemporary Christian communities. Selected modern Roman Catholic theories. Selected Protestant approaches. And similarities in Eucharistic practice in Christian traditions. On the 2017 AS paper, there was a question on selected Protestant approaches. That's the only question there has been. And so if the Eucharist appears again, I imagine it's either going to be and explain the importance, or it's going to be selected modern theories. The Part B, so this is what you should expect in terms of evaluation, but I want to remind you that the evaluation can be drawn from any aspect of the content, so any of that in 4B could be turned into an AO2 evaluation question. But here, it's the extent to which there is any common ground within contemporary understandings of the Eucharist. That was asked in AS 2017. Or the extent to which theoretical beliefs about the Eucharist affect the practice of different denominations. That is untested. That's basically just saying, do Christians practice the Eucharist in different ways because of their beliefs? Then I'm going to take you to the examiner's report for the AS exam of 2017. I'm going to put the link to this in the bottom of the video and I will tweet it. And so you can see on the AS exam of 2017, and remember there's quite a lot of shared ground between the AS 2017 and AS 2019. So there's a Sally McFay question with the mark scheme. There's a question on the Trinity with the mark scheme. Well, not the mark scheme, but features of stronger and weaker answers rather, so still useful. Bultmann on the resurrection. Love your neighbour. And then here, explain different Protestant approaches to understanding the Eucharist. So, if you're struggling with the Eucharist, this examiner's report might be useful to you. And so it talks about features of stronger answers, so detailed knowledge, accurate explanations. Weaker answers, spend too long outlining the Last Supper, confused Protestant and Catholic approaches. Part B is there is no common ground between the way that Christians celebrate the Eucharist. That's an interesting, explain differences within as well as across traditions, but weaker answers. Again, it's often about subject knowledge or not answering the question. This is my suggested answer for a question, so it's a Part B, asking how different practices reflect different beliefs. It should say, evaluate this statement here. So, as always, I'm going to highlight where I'm using key terms, my evidence, sources of wisdom. Sources of wisdom, because this is not really a Bible question as such, although I'm going to talk about the Last Supper, mainly comes from the Catholic Catechism, actually. Analysis and evaluation, that's me pausing, unpacking, asking if views are convincing or not. Scholars, schools of thought. again, it isn't a scholar-heavy question, but I am going to refer to people like Zwingli and Luther or Calvin who, adapt Catholic ideas or existing ideas about the Eucharist and then linking back to the question. So, as always, I start with my thesis statement that does link back to the question and give my view. So, the question is, or the statement is, the different practices across Christian groups are due to their different theoretical beliefs about the sacrament. Now look at the opening of my thesis statement. There are differences in the way that the Eucharist is celebrated that reflect the theoretical beliefs about the sacrament. So I have linked my thesis statement to the question. And then this is my view here. So I am taking the line that there are differences to do with Roman Catholics believing in transubstantiation and other denominations not doing so. And then I say that the contrast between denominational practices becomes even clearer when you look at Quakers and the Salvation Army, who, because of their beliefs, that's the link there, do not celebrate the Eucharist. So my opening paragraph is going to explain, but I am going to evaluate after, or I'm building my case really, because I'm arguing that yes, the beliefs manifest themselves in different practices. So my first key term that I am using is transubstantiation, and I'm saying because Roman Catholics believe in transubstantiation, they celebrate the Eucharist in a particular way. And so, for example, they think that the bread and wine have a real presence. That's a key term there for Roman Catholics. They have the real presence of Christ. And so the Eucharist is very much shaped around showing extreme reverence to the bread and wine. And then I give lots of examples, and my source of wisdom is the Catechism. To be honest, if you're giving a Catholic belief, you can just say it's in the Catechism, because that's where Catholic beliefs and practices come from. So the Eucharist should be received in a respectful and solemn tone. So that's my evidence for the way that Roman Catholics celebrate the Eucharist because of their beliefs. There's also a tradition that the Eucharist should be taken every week and possibly even daily. There's also a tradition that Roman Catholics fast before taking the Holy Communion. I could have added in extra detail there about Pope Paul VI in, I think, the 1960s, saying that fast, possibly 1970s, that fast only had to be for an hour, but I knew I was running out of time. There's also the idea that because the hosts or the bread and wine have the real presence of Christ, again, there's an instruction in the Catechism that any leftovers should be consumed immediately by the priest, that any hosts that are dropped should be picked up reverently. That's the exact wording the Catechism uses. Any spilled wine washed with water, and then that water disposed of in the sanctuary, because, the water has come into contact with the blood of Christ. There's also ornate chalices, and there's even rules about how often the incense should be waved. I think it's 3 times, but I couldn't remember, so I just said there's a rule. Okay, so there's very much a sense that within the Roman Catholic Mass, it's building up to the Eucharist. The Eucharist is the centre. I'm then going to contrast with Protestant churches. And within Protestant churches, you have high and low churches. And the high churches are going to be much, much more similar to the Roman Catholic position. So I then talk about the Protestant churches believing in either consubstantiation or memorialism. If you don't know what these key terms mean, you need to learn it. And so because they think that there is not a physical presence in the blood and wine, in the bread and wine rather, there's less sort of pomp and grandeur about it. So you will not have the ornate chalices, you will not have the incense. Also, the Eucharist is taken less often and perhaps is not so much of a focal point of the service. But then I've got my counter argument. And I'm saying actually though, that when you look in the Anglican Church and some Lutheran churches, the ceremony or the Eucharist service might not look quite so different. And so although they have got slightly different beliefs, the actual Eucharist service might happen weekly. It still has that sense of structure and formality. And so there I have linked back to the question, and I have said that theoretical beliefs may not cause a big difference in practice. So I'm aware now that I'm ending a paragraph disagreeing with my thesis statement. And so now I'm going to counter that. And I'm using a nice analysis and evaluation phrase in contrast. So when you compare the Eucharistic practices of the Roman Catholic Church with Reformed churches who are inspired by the teachings of Zwingli or Calvin on the Eucharist, their service is going to look very different. So I've got memorialism and virtualism here. And it's going to look very different because their beliefs about the Eucharist are very different. So for a start, this is my building of evidence, it's called the Lord's Supper, and there's much more focus on reenacting the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper. Much more than this sense of reverence because Jesus is literally present. And so there are fewer rules about handling the bread and wine. It may be taken less frequently, perhaps, just once a month. Perhaps reading scripture is going to be seen as more important. But then I'm going to counter that and I'm going to say, but actually, a member of these Reformed churches might say you're focusing too much on the differences and, the different beliefs don't necessarily mean a hugely different practice. So just like Roman Catholics, we approach the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper as they call it with reverence and solemnity. Just like Roman Catholics, we have a period of reflection before taking the Eucharist. And they say we're not having the Eucharist as often, not because it's not as important, but it's giving us extra time to reflect and prepare. And then I'm going to counter again so that I end on a view that matches my thesis statement. And this time I'm going to refer to Quakers and the Salvation Army. And they are two denominations that think that rituals like the Eucharist are just unhelpful. They say that they're a distraction and a cause of tension. And because of that belief, they don't celebrate the Eucharist. And you can't get a bigger difference than that. So now I'm going to my conclusion. And look how I have linked my conclusion with the statement. So if we go back to the statement, the different Eucharistic practices across different Christian groups are due to their different theoretical beliefs. And then my conclusion reads, in conclusion, the different practices across different groups are due to different beliefs about the Eucharist. So beautifully mirroring my thesis statement and the question. And this could be of beliefs about whether Jesus is present in the Eucharist or whether rituals are helpful in forming a relationship with Jesus. So to remind you, the statement is asking whether different beliefs result in different practices. I am arguing that they do, and I contrast the way that Roman Catholic beliefs in transubstantiation are put into practice with Protestant beliefs, in particular memorialism from Zwingli and virtualism from Calvin, and in addition the belief of the Quakers and the Salvation Army that rituals are not helpful and in fact are divisive, and so they should be rejected, which obviously is at the complete other end of the spectrum from Roman Catholic practice.